Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be talking about the 50-30-20 budgeting rule. And we're using this awesome blog post from DigyKeys as our guide today. They offer a whole bunch of cool digital resources. But honestly, some of the stats in this post about saving rates, they kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how simple the 50-30-20 rule is, but it can be so powerful. It's really great for people who are just starting out with budgeting.
Okay, so let's break this 50-30-20 thing down. What's the main idea here?
Basically, you split your after-tax income into three different categories. So 50% goes to your needs, 30% to your wants, and then 20% to savings and paying off any debt.
So it's kind of like cutting up, you get a big slice for the things you got to have. And a decent slice for fun stuff. And then a slice for the future. I like that analogy. But let's dig into those categories a little bit more. So when we say needs, what are we really talking about?
Think of needs as the non-negotiables, the stuff you absolutely have to pay for to, live your life. Things like housing, utilities, groceries, transportation, and basic healthcare.
That makes sense. But where's that line between a need and a want? Like, for instance, the DigyKeys post brought up organic produce. Is that a need or a want? I could honestly see it both ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it shows how flexible the 50-30-20 rule really is. If you're on a super tight budget, maybe organic produce is a want. But if you've got more wiggle room and healthy eating is a big priority for you, it could be a need. It's all about your own situation and what matters most to you.
So it's less about being strict and more about having some guidelines and making choices.
Exactly. Now let's move on to wants. That 30% is where you get to have some fun and personalize your budget. This covers stuff like, going out to eat, hobbies, travel, entertainment, anything that you enjoy that isn't absolutely essential.
I bet some of our listeners are already thinking about what they'd put in their wants bucket. What are some of the most common things you see people putting in this category?
Oh, it's all over the place. Some people prioritize travel, others are super into their hobbies, and some folks allocate a good chunk to hanging out with friends and entertainment. The best part is, it's your 30%. You get to spend it on what makes you happy.
I love that. Okay, so now let's talk about that 20% for saving in debt. This is where we get serious about the future.
Right, absolutely. This is the foundation of financial security. It's about building an emergency fund so you're ready for those surprise expenses, saving for retirement, and paying down any high-interest debt you might have, like credit cards, all those important things that a lot of people tend to put off.
And that's what makes that stat from the DigyKeys blog post so concerning. They said that the personal saving rate in the U.S. was only 4.4% as of November 2024. That's wild. It really shows how important this 20% allocation is.
Yeah. It's pretty alarming. It really suggests that most people aren't saving nearly enough.
So let's say I'm totally on board with this 50-30-20 idea. Where do I even start? How do I actually put this into action?
The first step, and this is super important, is to calculate your after-tax income. That's the number you'll use to figure out those 50%, 30%, and 20% amounts.
Yeah, I can definitely see how some people might accidentally use their pre-tax income and mess things up. The DigyKeys post also mentioned using budgeting apps, which seems like a really smart idea.
Well, for sure. Apps like Mint or YND can be super helpful. They can connect to your bank accounts, automatically categorize your spending, and give you this clear picture of where your money's actually going.
I love how technology can simplify things like that. Speaking of making things easier, the post also talked about the power of automation.
Oh, yeah. Automating your savings and debt payments is honestly one of the best things you can do for your finances. It's like putting your goals on autopilot. You're constantly making progress without even having to think about it.
That's awesome. All right, so we've got the basics down, and I'm already feeling more organized. But let's be real. Are there any downsides to this 50-30-20 rule? It can't be perfect for everyone, right?
You're right. No system is one size fits all. And the DigyKeys blog post actually acknowledges that. One potential issue is how tricky it can be to separate needs from wants in certain situations, especially when you're dealing with categories that are kind of subjective, like entertainment or personal care.
Right, like we talked about earlier with the organic produce thing. It's not always black and white.
Exactly. And the post also points out that the 50-30-20 rule might not be the best fit for people with really low incomes.
Because their essential needs could already be more than 50% of their income, which wouldn't leave much room for anything else.
That's a really good point. But what about people on the other end of the spectrum? People with really high incomes, would they even need to budget at all? Well, high earners might have more flexibility with their finances, but the 50-30-20 rule can still be valuable for them. It encourages mindful spending habits and helps ensure they're putting enough money towards savings and investments.
So even if you're making bank, it's still important to be intentional with your money. That makes a lot of sense.
The 50-30-20 rule is more of a framework than a strict set of rules. You can tweak the percentages to fit your own situation. The main thing is to have a plan and be aware of where your money's going.
And speaking of being aware, the DigyKeys blog post mentioned that the U.S. saving rate in 2023 was only 4.51%. That's crazy low. It really highlights how impactful this rule could be for helping people save more, no matter how much they earn.
Definitely. By making a conscious effort to set aside 20% for savings and debt repayment, you're setting yourself up for a much more secure financial future.
Okay, so we've gone over the basics of the 50-30-20 rule, and I'm already starting to see how it could be a game changer. Before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to DigyKeys. Since they're the source of all this great info, they actually have a digital budget planner that's designed specifically for this rule.
Right.
It's called the DigyKeys Budget Planner, and it's got some really neat features to help you track your spending, categorize your transactions, set financial goals, and see how you're doing over time.
Sounds like it takes a lot of the headache out of budgeting. We'll definitely put a link to that in our show notes for anyone who wants to check it out. But for now, let's move on to the next part of our deep dive.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the 50-30-20 budgeting rule. We've talked about the basics, but I want to touch on something that the DigyKeys blog post really emphasized, and that's the psychological impact of this approach.
Oh yeah, the psychology of money. This is where things get really interesting for me. I'm all about understanding, the mental and emotional side of finances. So what did the post have to say about that? The 50-30-20 rule can be a total game changer when it comes to reducing financial stress and guilt. A lot of times traditional budgeting, it focuses on restriction and deprivation. But with the 50-30-20 rule, you're consciously allocating money to both your needs, A, and D, your wants, so you're acknowledging that it's okay to enjoy your money while still being responsible.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like giving yourself permission to spend money on things you love without feeling guilty. As long as it's within that 30% limit, no more beating yourself up over buying a new book or, going out with friends. As long as it's in your budget, of course.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from what you can't have to finding that balance. You're not denying yourself. You're just making conscious choices about how to use your money.
I like how you put that. Instead of saying, I can't afford that, it becomes, I'm choosing to prioritize this. It's about feeling empowered, not restricted.
Right. And when you feel like you're in control of your money, you're way more likely to make smart decisions and actually stick to your plan. You're the one in the driver's seat, not your impulses.
That feeling of control can be so motivating. It takes away all that anxiety and stress that a lot of people feel about money.
For sure. It's about making your money work for you, not against you. Okay, so we've talked about the benefits, the potential downsides, and the psychological stuff. But let's get practical for a second. The DigyKeys blog got some really good advice on how to make this rule work in real life.
Yeah, let's dive into those practical tips. What are some things that stood out to you from the post?
One thing I always tell people is to set realistic goals. Don't try to change everything overnight. Start by making small changes, little by little. It's about building habits that you can actually stick with, not doing something drastic that you can't keep up.
Yeah, so maybe instead of cutting your wants, spending in half all at once, you could try reducing it by 10% this month, and then another 10% next month. It's like that saying, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time.
Exactly. Small wins help you stay motivated and make the whole process feel less overwhelming. Another important tip from the DigyKeys post is to track your progress. Don't just set your budget and forget about it. Look at it at least once a month, see what's working, and what you might need to adjust.
And that's where those budgeting apps we talked about earlier can be so helpful. They can make tracking so much easier. Even automate a lot of it.
Absolutely. Technology is a huge help when it comes to budgeting. Those apps can connect to your bank accounts, categorize your transactions for you, and even send you alerts if you're getting close to your limit in a certain category. It's like having a personal finance assistant in your pocket.
It's so cool. It's like technology can help us outsmart our own bad habits, especially with impulse spending. What other practical tips did the DigyKeys post have?
They talked about getting creative with your spending. Look for ways to reduce your needs without sacrificing your quality of life. It's all about being resourceful and finding those little things that add up over time.
Like maybe negotiating a lower rent with your landlord? Or switching to a cheaper cell phone plan. Those are great examples. Sometimes it just takes a little effort to find savings that can make a big difference.
Exactly. And when it comes to your wants, think outside the box. There are so many ways to enjoy life without spending a ton of money.
Yeah. like free concerts in the park, potluck dinners with friends, going hiking on local trails. I'm all about those budget-friendly adventures.
Me too. It's about being mindful and intentional with your spending, not about depriving yourself. Remember, you still have 30% for wants. It's just about using it wisely.
Right, and speaking of that 20% for savings and debt, the DigyKeys post really stressed the importance of automation. It made a good point. Why rely on willpower when you can just set it up so the money moves automatically?
Yeah, setting up automatic transfers to your savings account or to your debt payments is honestly one of the most powerful things you can do. It's like paying yourself first. You're making your financial goals a priority before you even have a chance to spend that money on something else.
I've done that with my retirement savings, and it's made a huge difference. It's like the money just disappears before I can even think about spending it. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Exactly. That's the magic of automation. It helps you prioritize your long-term financial well-being without having to constantly remind yourself. But, I'm sure there's one question that's on a lot of people's minds. What happens if you mess up?
Yeah, that's a good point. What if you overspend in one category?
Right.
Or you have a surprise expense? Does that mean the whole system falls apart?
Well, it's going to happen to all of us at some point. Life throws curveballs. And we're not perfect. The important thing is to not get discouraged. And definitely don't give up on the whole budgeting process. Remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about being flexible and adaptable. Just like with any healthy habit, it takes practice and adjustments along the way.
Exactly. If you overspend in one category, see if you can make up for it in another. Or if something unexpected comes up, just adjust your budget. It's like dancing, finding your rhythm and adjusting your steps as you go.
I love that analogy. It's not about being super strict and rigid. It's about figuring out what works for you
Right.
and adapting as you go. So are you ready to move on to the last part of this deep dive and wrap everything up?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's finish things up and give our listeners some final actionable takeaways on the 50-30-20 budgeting rule.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the 50-30-20 budgeting rule. We've learned about the basics, the psychology behind it, and even some tips for making it work in our everyday lives.
And now it's time to wrap it all up and really think about what this means for you.
Yeah, after covering so much, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
The 50-30-20 rule, it's more than just a budgeting technique. It's like a whole philosophy. A shift in how you think about spending, a way to feel more in control of your money.
I like that. So it's not just about the numbers. It's about knowing what's important to you, making choices that align with your values, and taking charge of your financial future.
Exactly. And it's not about feeling deprived or restricted. It's about finding that sweet spot, balancing enjoying your life today with being financially secure in the long run.
And speaking of financial security, I want to mention again that DigyKeys, the website we're using for our deep dive today, they actually have a digital budget planner, and it's specifically designed for this 50-30-20 rule.
Oh, yeah. It's called the DigyKeys Budget Planner. And it can be super helpful for anyone who wants to actually put this rule into action.
We'll make sure to include a link to their website in our show notes. But before we wrap up completely, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. What's one small thing they can do today to start moving towards their financial goals?
The 50-30-20 rule is a great place to start, but the best budget is one that really works for you. One that fits your own goals and values. So I want you to think about this. What's one change you could make today to start aligning your spending with what matters most to you?
That's a great question. It could be something small, like setting up an automatic transfer to your savings account, cutting back on one expense you don't really need, or even just starting to pay more attention to where your money's going.
Even small steps can make a huge difference over time. Remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about making progress.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the 50-30-20 budgeting rule. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
It's been great exploring this topic with you.
And a big thanks to all of you listening for joining us on this journey of financial discovery.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep taking control of your financial well-being.